Hello and welcome to today's episode on how to be a great player. We're tackling the thorny issue of min-maxing. That idea that with statistics as a base for your game, you have certain statistics that are exceptionally average or low, and then you have one or two choice attributes that are pumped up to their absolute maximum. I'm not going to sit here and tell you why it's good and why it's bad, other than to sit here and tell you why it's good and why it's bad. If you are a min-maxer, if you are not a min-maxer, I am unpacking the advantages and disadvantages that you have of the idea of being a min-maxer or an average Joe. Now, both have got virtues, both have got negatives. However, I personally will always prescribe what I'll tell you at the end of this video, won't I? So if we look at the idea of min-maxing, pumping up certain stats at the cost of others, that's a min-maxer versus an average Joe, which is to have average statistics. No one shines over the other, or at least not particularly, and none of them are very high, but at the same time, none of them are particularly low either. They are literally just somewhere in between. If we look at that, what does it give us? Well, the min-maxer becomes a specialist, and of course the average Joe is a generalist. What's the difference between a specialist and a generalist? Well, these are huge. I'm going to use those terms rather than min-maxer and average Joe, just because I think it helps to give them both validity, as well as to maybe allow you to look at both of them without all of the stigma that goes with min-maxer and average Joe. So, a specialist, if we look at it in broad strokes, will generally succeed on very specific roles, hence them being a specialist. On those special roles, they will almost invariably always succeed because their statistics are skewed in such a way that when they are making their attacks or when they are trying to avoid things or when they're trying to remember things, those values have been pumped up to the maximum possible allowance by the game, and that allows them to succeed generally on those roles. On the other hand, anything outside of that realm, anything outside of those areas that they have increased to their maximum, they will generally have a 50% chance of success, or something even less than that, depending on how extreme they are in terms of their specialization. Generalists, on the other hand, will succeed some of the time and will fail some of the time at all skills and at all roles. Now, does that sound particularly fun? Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail, as opposed to you will always almost succeed in this particular area and you will almost never succeed in that particular area. Well, it speaks to two different role-playing experiences, doesn't it? And it's about that we need to look at the min-maxer versus the average Joe, the specialist versus the generalist. Now, and I had to write this down as two separate columns so that I can compare and make sense of this whole matter. If you then look at the one that is almost invariably always succeeding at one thing and almost invariably failing at the other, you will be naturally inclined to only participate in things where you can succeed and avoid things where you can't. Oh, I'm no good at medicine, I've got low wisdom or low intelligence. Oh, no, I'm no good at combat. My percentage chance of hitting someone is very, 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 very low. I'm going to go and run around in the background. What this means is that your potential for role-playing starts to become very narrow. You can only do X or you can only do Y, and you avoid doing P and Q because, well, you're not very good at them and you're probably going to fail. Although, yes, there is an option for role-playing why you don't do something, generally speaking, it's just a dismissive, well, I'm not very good at it, so somebody else can do it. On the other hand, the generalist, who has a fair chance of succeeding or failing, depending on where the dice roll, have a greater chance for role-playing because they can participate in almost everything that they encounter, whether it's trying to repair the engine, whether it's trying to siege a castle. They will be able to participate in all of those areas. So it allows them the opportunity to then role-play in almost all of the situations that the GM throws at them. This is a benefit and a hindrance. The reason why it becomes a hindrance is that specialists make room for other players, characters anyway, to participate and to shine in their particular area. Generalists, because everyone can do everything, don't often allow for each other to succeed in one area and in another. Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, let's see. Specialists have limited area for failure, or at least a fear of failure, and so they avoid it. Generally, specialists are played by players who are trying to mitigate the amount of negative rolls they have, the amount of failures they have. Whereas generalists, of course, are embracing failure as being part of the narrative. At least that's been my experience in terms of generalists versus specialists. There are lots of specialists out there. People love to be able to succeed at things. That's one of the reasons why we play this game. On the other hand, generally speaking, those that are more focused around story don't min-max because they enjoy the option of failing and then trying to make the story work thereafter. So failure is usually avoided by the specialists and usually embraced by the generalists. So if you don't mind failing and you're more interested in story, maybe generalist is more in your line of thinking as opposed to specialist. And if you're wondering how to make your game more interesting, a generalist option might be the way for you to go. On the other hand, if you don't like that sort of thing, specializing seems to be the way to go. Now, the problem that comes in with specialization is that it's a fairly flat story progression. If you're a good gunslinger, your story is only going to really focus around gunslinging stuff. It's not going to branch out into other areas. You're not going to discover other things because as a player you're going to avoid those other things because you're never going to succeed at those roles, and also you're only going to move towards things where you can succeed, which is only going to be gunslinging stories. Generalists, on the other hand, because they are so diverse and can go into different areas, have a more diverse story option available to them. They can literally go and explore every option that the GM throws at them because they don't mind failing, and their stats and skills and attributes and feats and all the things that you use in your mechanical system to emulate the character are focused around diverse things. So from a narrative progression, the specialist has a fairly flat storyline, it just proceeds forward, and let me tell you, most Hollywood movies use a flat progression. Good sword slinger faces against bad sword slinger, good sword slinger eventually defeats bad sword slinger, not good sword slinger faces against bad sword slinger wins, good sword slinger becomes a mathematical genius and defeats bad sword slinger by using a mathematical equation. Generally, Hollywood likes the sword slinger to become triumphant right at the end. So that's not to say that their story isn't interesting. It's just to say that their story is usually a progression in the same line, in the same field that they are based in. Now, because of that, the class that you are playing, the profession, the occupation, whatever your general character idea is also going to remain fixed. It's not going to change. If you're a sword slinger now, in 20 years' time, you're still going to be a sword slinger because your stats that you've minimized and maximized speak to that specific area of focus. The generalists have got more options of diversifying and going off in different directions. Now that's, in some rule systems, multi-classing, which has its own stigmas and things attached to it. But from a narrative perspective, it allows your character to change and evolve over time, as opposed to the specialists whose character doesn't change over time, but just gets better at something very specific. That can become boring if you're running a long-term campaign and your character is there for a long time. So that's something to bear in mind. If you get easily bored with the same character type and you know that you're settling in for a long-term campaign, generalization might be better than specialization. Now, the specialist works really well in good big groups, especially if you've got specialists in different areas. So the specialist allows each character, if they're all specialists, to shine in their specific area, and it allows for the GM to move between them, utilizing those specializations really easily, because we know that that's the helmsman, that's the science officer, that's the engineer, and that's the captain, and their statistics are going to allow for those areas to be used and maximized and utilized to the best of their advantage. Generalists, on the other hand, work better in smaller groups because they cover a wide area of expertise. You might argue, let us say, they cover a wide area of skills, which they're not very good at, but they're also not very bad at. A smaller group works better. In larger groups where you've got so many generalists running around and everyone can do everything, it starts to become a problem where the actual characters, the players who dominate the conversation, are the ones who get to make all of the roles and decisions and the successes and the failures because, well, everyone can do everything. So smaller groups for generalists, bigger group for specialists. Now, this also plays into the whole idea that a small group allows for a much more complicated story as opposed to a large group where the stories are fairly flat. This sits very well with what we've established as a specialist versus a generalist already. So again, these things start to fall into place and make sense. Now, the final thing to say on specialization versus generalization is that specializations have, and I've completely forgotten it, clear roles. Right, so specialists have clear roles. There's no confusion as to what a fighter needs to do. They need to fight. There's no confusion as to what a priest needs to do. There's no confusion as to what an investigator needs to do versus a neurosurgeon, for example. So specialization allows for very clear roles. And that means, in my mind anyway, it's very good for those that are starting out in the role-playing space because you know exactly what you need to do and you know what's expected of you. Generalists, on the other hand, because they have a broad range of skills, means that the players need to be more au fait, more aware of all of the options that are available to them because they need to fulfill all of the different roles. So it requires a little bit more of advanced thinking and of course allows you to not have a clearly defined role so you can mission, mash and fit into both spaces or all of the spaces depending. So is min-maxing good or is it bad? As far as I'm concerned, it's about what do you want as the player and what is your group like. If there's just 2 of you, I would never recommend specialization, I would recommend generalization. If there are 20 of you, I would recommend specialization and not generalization, so that not everybody is making all of the roles all the time. I hope this has been slightly insightful and inspired you to perhaps play a generalist in your next game or to try and be a specialist in your next game. And whether, of course, you agree with the idea of pumping up certain stats and ignoring others, that's a mathematical question which other channels handle much better than I would ever do. So until next time, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more on these kinds of conversations. And something that I'm now toying with is the idea of running live Twitch sessions. This is something that is brewing and is not on the cards until maybe mid-December, but something to think about. I'd love your feedback in terms of what you'd like to see me doing live. I'm not entirely sure if anyone would like to see me doing anything live. They'd far rather prefer seeing me do something dead. Anyway, the idea is to do a Twitch stream on a Saturday afternoon here in sunny South Africa or in Japan, wherever I end up, and doing something where you can interact and ask questions, perhaps on the fly. Something most people are currently looking at is adventures and characters as we go forward designing those during the live Twitch stream. Anyway, leave your comments below on something that you'd like to see me do. Some people have said, oh, they just want to see me playing role-playing games on computer games and dissecting it from a story perspective and a character perspective and that kind of thing. Anyway, those are some ideas to think about for the future. But until then, I wish you and yours the happiest of playing.